Welcome. Thank you for joining me for another look at a psalm. And today's psalm is Psalm 71. I'm often trying to encourage you, as you'll know if you follow these little studies, to look for the keys that open up individual psalms. There are different clues in different psalms. It's very clear in Psalm 71 that the key to understanding this psalm lies in verse 9 and then in verse 18, which are almost repetitions of each other. Verse 9 says, "Do not cast me off in the time of old age, forsake me not when my strength is spent." And then verse 18, "So even to old age and grey hairs, O God, do not forsake me." So this is a psalm of David as he gets older. We don't know exactly when in his life, but he contemplates old age if he's not quite there yet. And his great cry and concern is that even when he's old and his faculties are diminishing and all the rest of it, he will still know God being as faithful to him as he always has been through his life. Those of you that are of a certain generation will remember the old Beatles song, "When I'm 64, will you still need me? Will you still love me?" Now you can't exactly apply that here, but the same sentiment is here. Even when I'm old, oh God, please be as faithful to me as you always have been. And David takes three different looks at life here. He looks at the past, he looks at the present, he looks at the future. But initially I want you to notice what he says about the character and the nature of God. There are four wonderful descriptions of God in this psalm. In verses 3 and 7, he describes God as his rock of refuge, as his strong refuge. We've seen many times already in the Psalms how David continually runs to and stands on and hides in the rock who is God. The rock is not only a picture of God or a metaphor of God, it is also used in the scriptures as a name of God, as in Deuteronomy 32, for example. God is the rock of his people. Then also we see here in verse 3 that God is his fortress. He's a strong tower where the righteous, where his own people can find safety and protection. In verse 5, David describes God as his hope, and again in verse 5 as his trust. That's where his confidence is. It's a wonderful picture of God that David paints for us here. But then notice the three perspectives David takes on life. First of all, he looks to the past and he testifies to God's faithfulness to him from his youth and indeed even before. Look at verses 5 and 6, for example. "Upon you I have leaned from before my birth. You are he who took me from my mother's womb." David says his life has always been, from the moment of conception, one of utter dependence on God. And God has been utterly faithful to him through all that period of time. He says it again in verse 8 and again in verse 17. From my youth, he speaks about God's faithfulness to him down through the many years. And again, he continually praises God and testifies to him for that faithfulness. "My mouth," verse 8, "is filled with your praise and with your glory all the day." So he looks back and he tracks his life and he sees that, no doubt against his own waywardness and disobedience, God has been steadfastly and resolutely faithful to him in the past. And then he looks around at the present, and some things never change, is in effect what David is saying. Although he's conscious of his getting older and all the rest of it, one thing he highlights has not changed, and that he is now, as ever, surrounded by his enemies. There's a continuing presence of his enemies. He says in verse 4, "Rescue me from the hand of the wicked." Verses 10 and 11, "My enemies speak concerning me. Those who watch for my life consult together." Throughout David's life, it seems, he was never out of the attack of those who hated him and were set against him for all sorts of reasons. And we find perhaps as we go through life, we face the same challenges, the same difficulties, all the way through the changing seasons of our lives. So the past, the present, and then David looks to the future. Look particularly at verses 20 to 24. "Even to old age," and then he says, "You have made me see many troubles and calamities," verse 20, "will revive me again." God will continue to be faithful. God will continue to revive and strengthen him. God will continue to deliver him from his enemies. And David, in response, will continue to give God the praise and the worship that's due to him, and testify to his faithfulness to his people. Look at those closing verses of the psalm. We might call this psalm, through all the changing scenes of life, here's God's faithfulness promised to his people. And whatever stage you are at life at this moment in time, I want to assure you, based on the authority of God's word, that the God who has been faithful to you will be faithful to you all the way to the end. The Lord bless you, and the Lord keep you.